Good morning and welcome at the Diplomatic Academy. I welcome you all on behalf of the Diplomatic Academy and the Institute for the Danube area in Central Europe. This international conference is our modest common contribution to the 100th anniversary of the end of the Great War and for the Austrian 100-year anniversary as a republic. It's quite an ambitious undertaking, this one-day conference, because we want to ask the question why history matters. And let me, at the beginning, say a few words about what happened the last few days regarding politics of memory. On last Sunday's 100th commemoration of Armistice Day in Paris brought together about 70 world leaders. And it was a telling symbolic story about the place of history in today's European politics, as I feel. While the French president, Macron, strongly warned against a new nationalism, the British Prime Minister, May, was not even taking part in the ceremony. And President Trump did not participate in the following high-minded, typically French peace forum. Can we learn from history? The Canadian historian of the Paris peace treaties after World War I, Margaret Macmillan, once wrote about this question, and I quote her because I think there is something in it. She said, "We can learn from history, but we can also deceive ourselves when we selectively take evidence from the past to justify what we have already made up our minds to do." And that is, I think, very obvious. In the last few years, a lot of books, journalistic articles, but also politicians were speaking about history as a necessary means to understand what's going on in the European Union and in the coming world order. And a lot of them mentioned the Habsburg Monarchy. And for many Austrians, this was quite a surprise to be reminded that the Habsburg Monarchy is part of the Austrian history. I still remember that in 1995 we celebrated 50 years of Austria, and next year in 1996 we celebrated 1,000 years of Austria. So what are the lessons of 1918 for the world order? We will discuss this the whole day through, but if you look into the most recent books, it's more or less quite clear. It says the peace treaty should not be written by the victors alone. The idea that throughout the globe states should be nation states is a legacy of 1918, and this some sort of construction of the League of Nations did not work, but we continued to believe that it's possible to create a liberal international order with the United Nations and other international organizations. So that's more or less agreed as I see it. That's where we stand at the moment, in spite of all the challenges, not the least by the American administration. And what are the Habsburg lessons or Habsburg legacies for the European project? Maybe this is a bit more difficult to define. I give you one small example at the beginning. The Habsburg territory of exactly 100 years ago, 101 day ago, forms today part of 14 different countries. 14 different countries. I'm convinced that we can draw important lessons from the failure of the Habsburg monarchy more than from the successes of the Habsburg monarchy. And let me, at the beginning, only mention three essential lessons as I see them. Granting autonomy according to ethnic and national lines only whetted appetite for more autonomy and ultimately full sovereignty in the Habsburg case. Second, the emphasis on the rule of law and quite sophisticated institutional and judiciary setup of the late Habsburg monarchy was no guarantee against disintegration of this union. And three, a competent, meritocratic, and honest, quite honest bureaucracy was no guarantee either. Some of this may sound familiar when we discuss the European Union. But allow me also to stress two other lessons that we maybe should particularly reflect upon. One is that multinational governance has to take into account that any increase of centralization is not only today, not only under scrutiny regarding its efficiency, but also regarding its effect on national sovereignty and legitimacy. And I guess Jan Silonka will talk about these challenges we have there. And the second point is, in a multinational context, the strengthening of common emotional bonds is essential. We're always discussing about Europe can't be a market alone. Europe needs some sort of idea, a European soul. It is essential, but it is hard to achieve. Factors such as the lack of cultural unity, the incapacity to create a common vision for the future in harmony with the growth of a modern capitalistic society, and politics of memory for identity building at an ethnic or national level instead of a multinational level can make, and does make it sometimes, impossible to achieve the strengthening of emotional bonds at the multinational level. So, some of it sounds very familiar from the liberal period after 1867 in the Habsburg Monarchy. Nevertheless, to a different degree, the breakup of this old empire turned out to be a disaster for all of the peoples who had formed parts of it. And some historians even say that the biggest mistakes of the late Habsburg monarchy was not so much its structure, but it was the alliance with the Imperial Germany and finally the famous ultimatum to Serbia in July 1914. But, and maybe this is something optimistic for the European Union, this double monarchy was quite resilient even in its final years. And there are major differences between the Habsburg monarchy and the European Union. First, the EU is the product of a voluntary association of a number of sovereign democratic states. Its historical origin is not in conquest or heritage, and as we know, it's possible to leave the European Union in a peaceful way. And secondly, there is no, in a more or less peaceful way. You see, there is some sort of comparison possible and necessary. And secondly, there is no obvious hegemon in the European Union, and there is no significant group that could consider that its fundamental ethnic or national aspirations are not taken into account. There I'm also already hesitating. Despite the imperfections and the threat of illiberal regimes, democratic institutions are established everywhere in all the member countries. So there are a lot of questions we have to ask on what is the lesson that we can take from this. And I would only say it at this beginning, as much as there are more questions than answers, but there are a few obvious answers that have been discussed and we should discuss today as well. One of those is the European integration process after 1945 has deliberately avoided cultural issues. And maybe this was a good thing after the experience of the Second World War. But since 1989, the idea of necessary emotional bonds to get popular support for the European project has significantly gained ground. And I always remember Ralph Dahrendorf saying, Europe is a cold project, and you cannot succeed with a cold project. And what is the result of these necessary emotional bonds? And as we see it now, there is a renewed interest in politics of memory. History is back in town. In issues related to identities and borders. At the same time, we see radical political parties gather momentum by mobilizing fears of proximity, fears of touching. The interesting thing about this, and this again leads us back to 1918 and to the Habsburg monarchy, is what is the real function of borders in our European history and context? Is there something specific that can be learned from the history of European cooperation projects in the question of how we deal with borders? May they be internal, external, real, or imaginary borders? Have Europeans developed a specific ethics of borders? The key question, as I see it, and again, as a historian, Habsburg historian, I could give you a lot of examples. The key question is to understand borders not only as identity markers or as lines of separation between different identities, but to see them as spaces of transition between identities that have something in common. You can follow all the books of Claudia Magris. He is only writing about this fact, what the role of borders really is. And on a continent proud of cultural diversity, it is worth working towards a situation where borders stand for integration and not for rupture. If we agree this is the case, then as in Habsburg Monarchy, also today there is a need for European discussions about neighborhood as a potential for cooperation, for solidarity, but also for cross-border conflicts. Borders are, and this is for sure, unstable identity markers, even if they take the very physical shape of a Berlin Wall or ideas to build walls at the external borders of the European Union. These are only a few of the ideas that immediately come up when you discuss the relations between 1918 and 2018. And we had the feeling at this Academy that the Austrian discussion needs a little bit more than only talking about the very important issue of how democracy was established after 1918 and what it meant, these 100 years of republic, but to look a little bit beyond this. And I'm very much hoping that this will be a chance to discuss a few of these issues and also show that the experience of 1918, but also the history of the former Habsburg monarchy, offers rich material on the question why a European integration project may fail when it relies only on legal, bureaucratic, and economic strategies to overcome opposition and conflicts of interest. I'm not sure, and I think we are all not sure, whether going the harder way of deepening and widening the European Union with a readiness to discuss with the public, with the own population, the political, cultural, and also economic consequences, and then try to win majorities will be successful. I'm not sure whether the story that we are telling you is a story which will help us for more or for less Europe, but it's a story that needs to be told. Welcome for this conference.